What is up, guys? It is Quinn here, back with another player versus player video. So if you guys are new to the channel, this is where I take two fantasy football players at the same position. They're going in the same overall kind of ADP range, and I break these players down, go through, their current ADP, their 2020 season, their 2021 season, my outlook for them in 2022, and then I'll talk about which player I prefer at their current price. And so the two guys today, we're going to be at the wide receiver position. It's going to be Jaylen Waddle and Marquise Brown. So let's just jump right into it. Right now, Jaylen Waddle is going off the board as the wide receiver 15, and I'm using Underdog Fantasy's ADP. Marquise Brown is the wide receiver 16, so right after Waddle, and they're both kind of going late round 3, early round 4, so kind of like that 3-4 turn. And jumping into the 2020 season for Jaylen Waddle, this was his final season at Alabama. He played in 4 games before he messed up his ankle and then ended up missing like a huge chunk of the season. But I mean, in those 4 games, the man was balling out, caught 25 passes for 557 yards and 4 touchdowns. 557 yards in 4 games is pretty insane. And if you guys remember, like Waddle was the wide receiver 1 on this team ahead of Devonta Smith. Then when Waddle goes down, Devonta Smith obviously has that historic season, absolutely balls out, but Waddle was going to be the guy on that team. He did return for the national championship, but I mean, he was clearly still injured. If you remember, he was like hobbling around, jumping all over the place. The ankle was definitely not ready. Caught 3 passes for 34 yards, but obviously, bounced back in the NFL draft. The Dolphins selected him 6th overall to be their wide receiver 1 at the time. For Marquise Brown in 2020, he finished as the wide receiver 43 in points per game. That's a half-point PPR. Played in 16 games, targeted 100 times, caught 58 of those for 769 receiving yards, and then 8 receiving touchdowns. He actually had a really solid target share, 26.3%, which was actually 7th in the NFL. He was also 7th in air yard share and deep targets, but he was actually only 35th in total targets. So a lot of that came down to the Ravens averaging the fewest pass attempts per game in the NFL. I believe they were just over 25. So if you're only throwing the ball like 26 times a game, it is going to be very tough for a wide receiver on your team to really ball out, because Marquise Brown was the number 1 and still wasn't like a super solid fantasy football option. Now moving over to 2021, this was Jaylen Waddle's rookie season. Finished as the wide receiver 21.5 point PPR, 16 games, targeted 142 times, caught 104 of those for 1,015 receiving yards, and then 6 receiving touchdowns. Overall, just a super successful rookie season. He was 10th in the NFL in targets, 7th in receptions, 7th in route win rate, and then 6th in route win rate against man. So really impressive, for his first season in the NFL. Also a very impressive season for Marquise Brown, really kind of his breakout year. He had been a solid wide receiver, but hadn't really taken that next step. He did here in 2021, was the wide receiver 26 in points per game, played in 16 games, targeted 145 times, big jump from that last year, caught 91 of those for 1,008 receiving yards, and then 6 receiving touchdowns. He definitely benefited from the Ravens going much more pass heavy. A lot of that was due to their injuries at the running back position, J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, but then also just injuries to the defense. The defense really just couldn't stop anyone, so the offense had to be throwing to keep up. Marquise Brown was 9th in the NFL in targets, 12th in target share, 11th in air yard share, 8th in deep targets, 6th in unrealized air yards. He was 8th in route win rate, and then he was 9th in win rate versus man coverage. So you saw he could get it done, on an offense that did pass the ball more, and that's going to be very good for his 2022 outlook. So starting off with Jaylen Waddle here for the 2022 season, we know the Dolphins traded for Tyreek Hill, so he's likely no longer the number 1 option there. I mean, you'd assume Tyreek Hill would be the guy at least for this season. They also hired a new head coach, offensive-minded Mike McDaniels. So I think this offense really is just going to look totally different from what it did in 2021. Hopefully that means that Jaylen Waddle gets more yak opportunities, because last season we saw him see, a ton of targets, but he was kind of just like this short target funnel, which really doesn't match his skill set, which is like a super explosive playmaker, get the ball in his hands, let him make big plays. He was kind of just, sentenced to being this volume guy, which doesn't really fit his very impressive skill set. Right now, I'm projecting Waddle to finish really anywhere in like the wide receiver 2 range. I could see a high end wide receiver 2 finish, wide receiver 14, wide receiver 13. I could also, see him playing behind Tyreek Hill, finishing as like a lower end wide receiver 2, wide receiver 23, wide receiver 22. So I feel like that is his like realistic range of outcomes. For Marquise Brown, I feel like we can dive into this a little bit deeper. Obviously, we know he was traded to the Cardinals. He's going to be reunited with Kyler Murray. They balled out together at Oklahoma. And honestly, I'm expecting Marquise Brown to tear it up for the first 6 weeks of the season. DeAndre Hopkins suspended for that time. So Marquise Brown will step in as the clear number one wide receiver. I know Kyler's received a ton of hate this offseason. Some people don't think he's an elite quarterback, doesn't deserve a contract. Whatever you may think. Personally, I believe that Marquise Brown and Kyler Murray are going to make a great duo, especially early on in the season. Marquise Brown obviously excels deep down the field. He's a great deep threat. And Kyler Murray was fantastic throwing the deep ball last season. He was number one in deep ball completion percentage, number three in deep ball accuracy rating, and then number five in deep ball catchable pass rate. So that aligns very well with Marquise Brown. And honestly, I could see Marquise Brown as a top 12 wide receiver through the first 6 weeks. I feel like he could have some massive games early on in the season. My issue with Marquise Brown comes in where I think the production is going to fall off in week 7 once DeAndre Hopkins returns. This Cardinals offense loves to spread the ball around. We saw it last season. People kind of forget because DeAndre Hopkins was injured, towards the end of last season. He was pretty disappointing. He was drafted as like a wide receiver 1, and he was still putting up like mid-tier wide receiver 2 numbers, but he was very touchdown dependent. I remember I had him as like a, candidate to trade away basically every single week. He was only averaging 6.4 targets per game. That is not what you want to see out of your stud wide receiver. And at this point, I still think we have to believe that DeAndre Hopkins is the better player over Marquise Brown, even though they're kind of going in two different directions. You have Marquise Brown ascending, DeAndre Hopkins getting older, likely going to fall off a little bit. But there's just a lot of target competition on this team. The wide receiver room, when it's full strength, Hopkins, Brown, AJ Green, Rondell Moore. At tight end, you have Zach Ertz, who was heavily involved down the stretch last year. You have Trey McBride coming in. James Conner's going to catch passes out of the backfield. So I just don't know if he's really going to move the needle after, the first 6 weeks of the season. And so I could totally see a path where he's like wide receiver 15 through week 6. And then week 7 on, I could see him being like a wide receiver 3 and really just someone that's not going to be winning you weeks down the stretch. So I feel like you can kind of see what direction I'm going here. If I had to choose between Jaylen Waddle or Marquise Brown at this ADP, I would be favoring Jaylen Waddle. I think if the plan is to draft Marquise Brown and try to trade him after like week 3, week 4, it's possible that that works. I feel like you're kind of playing with fire because an injury, you're stuck with him. Also, I feel like there's just always going to be a discount because even if he's like the wide receiver 1 through like 4 weeks, everyone's going to have in their back of the mind that DeAndre Hopkins is returning and his overall price is going to take a hit. So over the full season, I would definitely prefer Jaylen Waddle here. He's an incredibly talented young wide receiver. I really do think Mike McDaniels is going to put him in positions to succeed, give him the yak opportunities that he saw in college. And so I'd rather bet on Jaylen Waddle here, but they're going in a similar range for a reason. So I think both players are going to be decent fantasy options this year. Let me know down below what player you guys would prefer, Jaylen Waddle or Marquise Brown. Let me know your reasoning, and I'll get back to every single person. But that is going to wrap it up for this one. I'll do one of these videos basically every week leading up until the NFL season. So thank you for stopping by. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.